Hope everyone can hear me well. My name is Stephanie Fraquin. I'm the coordinator of the Community of Practice on FGM. And I'm going to be moderating this webinar with my colleague Cynthia Umurungi, who is also here. She has her video on. And she is one of the two moderators of the Community of Practice on FGM. The other moderator being Isatou Yalo, who is also listening to us today, and who is handling our social media accounts. Okay, yeah, there's some text in Spanish, but that's fine. I think that's just yeah, that's fine. Okay, so Lucia, I'll just tell you when you can go ahead. Yeah, so that's fine. So welcome everyone. I think some people will join us as we continue. And so as I said, the presentation is also live streamed on Facebook. So if you want to, for whatever reason, be anonymous, not have your video showing, or not have your name showing, just make sure to remove your name. But of course, we would be happy to see who is participating in the webinar. So this webinar is a series of two webinars that we're organizing with the Community of Practice on FGM. The second one will be held on the 17th of June, 2020, so next week. It's going to be held in French, and the theme is also on mental health, well-being, and FGM. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, next again. Yeah, thank you. So we have a small program today. First, I'm going to give you a brief introduction of the Community of Practice on FGM, especially for those who may be new to the Community of Practice. And then, of course, we're going to give the floor to Venoranda, Rebecca Kuboka, and Farzana, Doctor, who are both therapists and activists. Cynthia will present them more in detail in a few minutes. And we will have quite a lot of time for questions and discussions at the end. Next slide. Yeah, so just before we start, a few small rules. So please keep your microphones on mute. If you have questions, which I hope you have, you can ask them in your chat box. So just on the right of the webinar. And we will answer all the questions at the end. And please don't hesitate as well if you want to share experience on working on mental health. You can do so as well. And we can give you the possibility to speak at the end of the presentations. And then, of course, please respect each other, but that's normal. Yeah, the next one. Yeah. So as I said, I wanted to present the Community of Practice. I know a lot of you already know the Community of Practice, but I think some of you might not. And I also thought it would be interesting to maybe hear a presentation of the CoP for those who know the Community of Practice, who've known it for a while, so that you can also think about how to present the Community of Practice to your colleagues and to other stakeholders that are interested in working against FGM. So the Community of Practice on FGM was launched in 2017. It's part of a larger project that's called Building Bridges Between Africa and Europe to Tackle FGM. It's a project that's coordinated by IDOS, which is an Italian NGO, and also run by GAMS Belgium, which I'm part of. And the Community of Practice and the Building Bridges Between Africa and Europe to Tackle FGM is supported by the UNFPA UNICEF Joint Program on FGM, which I'm sure many of you know, supports anti-FGM or FGM prevention work in Africa mostly. And so a Community of Practice is actually a group of people basically who share a common concern or passion or interest and who want to know and learn together how to do what they're doing better. So that's what we're doing in the Community of Practice on FGM. And the premise of this project is really the fact that FGM is a global issue, that it concerns all continents. And so not only Africa and Europe, of course, but also other continents, and that it concerns many different sectors. So that's really the starting point from the Community of Practice. Next slide, please. Yes. So the Community of Practice on FGM. So it's a virtual network. It's a network of professionals and activists, not only from Africa and from Europe, although in its start in 2017, the CoP did focus on these two continents. But today we have members, about almost 400 members from all continents. The members work in different sectors. They are researchers, they're policymakers, they're healthcare professionals. Some are technicians working in NGOs, journalists, activists in civil society. And all these members come together and share their experiences, their tools, and their information. They identify best practices, good practices in different countries that they think could be re-implemented elsewhere. And of course, the reason why members join the community of practice is because they think it's because they share the same objective, which is to improve the quality of prevention and support for women and girls affected by FGM. So that is really the main final objective of the community of practice on FGM. Next slide, please. So the approach of the community of practice is really a multi-sectoral and horizontal approach. So it's based on the idea that everyone has something to share. There's no hierarchy or no experience that's better than someone else's. Everyone comes in with their own experience and their own expertise from their sector. So whether you're an academic or you're a first-line professional or you're an activist, you have something to share when you work to prevent FGM or to care for women and girls with FGM. It's an approach of a collective intelligence. So we try to learn together to increase our knowledge, our individual knowledge, of course, and our collective knowledge, and also to gather that knowledge in a knowledge hub, which is the website. And what is also peculiar with the community of practice is that it's a bilingual space. So as I said, today we have an English-speaking webinar, but next week we have a French one. And actually the email group that the community of practice runs with is bilingual, so we always facilitate communication between French speakers and English speakers. And we felt that this is really a need, considering that, for example, in certain parts of Africa, people use French as a vehicular language, whereas in other parts they use English, and those two groups don't always communicate easily. And it's the same in Europe also, of course. And in the future, we would also love to have other languages, such as Arabic. Next, please. Yeah, so this slide is a little bit about how the community of practice functions so that you can understand better. So today, of course, we're organizing a webinar, but it's a small part of what the community of practice does. The most work and the most exchange between members is done on the Google Group forum, or it's an email list. And this is where members discuss, where they share information, where they share news on FGM, where they share their research, and also specific advice and contacts. So someone can ask for a trainer. They want to do a training for midwives in Mali, for example, and they don't have a trainer. They will ask on the list, and someone can provide them with a contact for a medical professional who can do this training. We use the blog as a sort of knowledge hub. We share all the resources for each theme on the blog, and also interviews and other ways of highlighting our members' experience and expertise. The social media accounts, Facebook and Twitter, are used to highlight what we learn through our collective knowledge on towards a bigger outer external group of people, the stakeholders that are not necessarily members, and also, of course, to communicate with the general public and make them interested in what we do and in the things that we learn about FGM. We also organize face-to-face meetings when we can. Of course, now during the COVID pandemic, it hasn't been possible. Otherwise, we would have been at the CSW in New York now in March, but unfortunately that was cancelled or postponed. And this enables members to meet, of course, because although a lot of things can be done through the web, through webinars or email exchanges, it is also really important to meet people face-to-face, to discuss their experiences, and to present their work. And something that I wanted to say also is that what I forgot to say about the fact that it's a bilingual space is that the moderators also help to facilitate communication between members by translation translating people's inputs so that French and English speakers can understand each other even if they don't speak the other language. Next, please. Yeah. So now you have some background information on the community of practice. And this is the reason why we're here today is that we organize thematic discussions. So every month or every couple of months, we organize a discussion on a specific theme, highlighting a specific area of work around FGM. Since 2017, various topics have been addressed, such as the link between religion and FGM, the type 4 FGM, so all different practices that go under the quite broad type 4, and the practices that do not currently go under type 4. We have addressed issues around law on FGM, and also cross-border FGM, which is a big issue in certain areas. We also discussed recently the economics around FGM, economic empowerment, and how economic status affects the FGM prevalence. We have discussed how FGM can be mainstreamed into other sectors and other areas of work, such as SRHR or other types of women's rights work and gender-based work against gender-based violence more generally. And the most recent topics that we discussed were strategies to tackle FGM. This is a sort of series, a thematic series that we have. We're going to have other topics later on in the year, but the first one we discussed was alternative rites of passage. And now, of course, we've also been discussing how COVID-19 affects FGM and vice versa. And now, of course, we're here to discuss mental health and well-being. And so on the right, you can see an example of a thematic note. So for every discussion, we provide members with a thematic note with some basic desk research and main areas of research on the topic. So this is really a way to try to get everyone on board and make sure that everyone, whatever their knowledge from the start of the discussion, that they can have some ideas of what this topic is about, and to make it easier for everyone to contribute in a meaningful way. We also invite experts to share their knowledge, such as today, of course, we have 2 experts, and next week we will have 3 experts in the webinar. So for this theme, we actually have 5 experts on board. And of course, other people can also share their experience, but we do always work specifically with experts who are more active in the theme and can really share their experience. We also do things like interviews or videos to highlight certain aspects of a theme. So, for example, we did a video on a type 4 practice in a Wolof community in Senegal, which is a community that is traditionally not known to practice FGM, but who actually practices a type 4 FGM called a removal of sotiot. And at the end of the discussion, we always also make a summary of the findings to keep really the collective knowledge, and that we also publish on the blog so that people who join the community of practice at a later stage can look back and see what has been done before. Next, please. So mental health and more generally holistic care for survivors of FGM have always been a very central issue for the community of practice. It was actually the first theme that we started working on when we launched the community of practice in 2017. We organized the first webinar 2017 with members of the Belgian FGM Center and also a Burkinabe gynecologist who's a member of the community of practice. I don't know if he's here today. You can watch this on the blog. I will send the link later. And what we know is that often care for survivors of FGM tends to focus on physical aspects. So defibrillation, how to treat a bleeding or a physical like kyst or other physical problems with FGM. And sometimes this has been done on the detriment for the more psychological or sexological complications. And that is why we thought it was really important to also raise awareness of mental health and sexological issues to really improve the capacity of service providers to not only provide physical services, but also mental health services for women and girls. And here you can see some of the questions that kind of frame the discussions that we're having right now on the community of practice. Next. So what we can say already just as an introduction to the theme is that, of course, we know that FGM has and can have a range of consequences for women and girls, whether in terms of physical health, but also, of course, in terms of mental health, whether short-term and long-term. However, we also know that from the experience that women themselves give, and also from the right research, it's impossible to have any systematic or universal idea of these consequences. Each woman and girl has their own experience of FGM, and so the psychological consequences also differ from one person to another. And it's really important in providing holistic care to always understand the consequences in the global life path of the affected woman and girl, and to also factor in different factors affecting how the person experiences FGM and how they experience also the long-term potential consequences. So, for example, factors affecting is, for example, how FGM was practiced. Did the girl know that she was going to go and be taken for FGM? What are the socio-demographic characteristics of the community practicing? The individual story of the girl, the personal coping mechanisms that she's put in place, and also the age of cut, because we know that depending on the age, girls don't experience FGM the same way and don't experience it the same way either when they're older and living as women. Next. Another thing that we can say before we are going to listen to our two speakers is that we also know that there's a mutual reinforcement between psychological and physical complications of FGM. And this can be, for example, women who suffer mental health issues may have fear to confront medical staff and have more difficulties, fear of stigma, for example. And this can, in turn, give difficulties in accessing health care services and have physical consequences for them. And the last thing that I wanted to highlight was that there is also a difference, of course, in terms of if you live in a high or low prevalence community, and this is something we were going to see in the presentations of the two speakers as well, and studying that migrant women living with FGM in Europe and in North America have shown that becoming out of the norm for someone who migrates from an FGM high prevalence community where having undergone FGM is what is expected and what is normal, can also be lived as a second trauma for affected women. And the very final point I wanted to make is that in our work since 2017 and also our desk research, what we have seen is that there's a lack of available data about services and especially mental health services in Africa. We did a trial of doing a psychosexual mapping of services for FGM in 2017. And we found it very difficult to get data on available services. And of course, these can be both holistic health services, so health centers providing not only physical health services, but also mental health and sexological health. So there are a few that we're going to see today and also next week in the Francophone webinar. But generally, it's difficult. And also we see in terms of research that a lot of research focuses on women living in migrant communities in North America or Europe. So there's really something to do here. And what we also want to highlight is the community-based support systems that exist in many areas, but that are not always very well documented. So not always accessible by Google, for example. Yeah, so we're hoping that through this discussion, we'll be able to shed some light on available health services, and that we will, of course, publish everything that we find at the end of the discussion. So now, without further ado, I will give the floor to my colleague, Cynthia. So Cynthia Umurungi, who is the moderator of COP on FGM, and she will present our two speakers.
Thank you very much, Steph, for presenting the COP. I hope it is clear and that we get many ambassadors from here to tell even other people to join us. So our presentation will be with two speakers, as you have seen, and that is Venoranda Rebecca Kuboka and Farzana Doctor. So we will start with Veneranda. I hope you all can hear me now. Yes, say yes or just put something in the chat. All right. So if at all, yes. So if at all you hear something that resonates with you or a question, just put it in the chat and we'll get back to you. So I'll start with Venoranda Rebecca Kuboka. She's a Kenyan and a youth and child therapist. She is experienced in sexual reproductive health, human rights, mental health, and advocacy. She is also the founder of Youth Changes Kenya, a community-based organization to promote sexual reproductive health. So there is also a fun fact on Venoranda. She is so fond of her name, Venoranda, that she doesn't remember who you're talking to whenever you call her Rebecca. So that is because there's a long story attached to her name. Apparently, she almost lost it when she was small because in school they wanted to insist that she must call herself Rebecca. So she has, she has that strong relationship with her name. That is Rebecca, and she'll start us off with the presentation, and I will definitely also introduce Farzana when it is her turn. The floor is yours, Venoranda.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for that powerful introduction. It's such an honor and a pleasure to talk to the different people who are presented here. I'll be sharing my experience working with FGM survivors in Kenya, and this is basically based on the different individual clients I've been seeing and those that I've been seeing through the different group sessions that I've been having. So to begin with, if I would have my presentation, great. So the context of the conversation is us understanding FGM and mental health. And the approach that I've been using in my intervention is engaging in individual group therapy. And I have under the individual therapy, I've been seeing a lot of girls and young women. And group therapy, I've also been working with girls, I've worked with young women, and I've worked with married women. And most of these people are from the Maasai, Somali, and the Samburu community. Please take me to the next slide. So one of the most frustrating things for me as a therapist is the fact that I have contracted a lot of vicarious trauma in the process of interacting with FGM survivors. And just to break it down a bit, vicarious trauma is a situation whereby you're reaching out to people who've gone through a traumatic experience, then you pick that trauma. To begin with, the experiences of FGM survivors are very, 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 very sad, and I will be highlighting a scenario in the next slide. They are extremely overwhelming. They are very, very frustrating, and they are so heartbreaking. I remember the first time I met one of the young girls I was interacting with in therapy. I honestly could not sleep at night. It was just so bad. It was really hard for me because I could not really understand or internalize how can someone do such a thing to a young girl. And just to give you a brief scenario, there's one of my girls who shared this with me, that my mom woke me up at 3 a.m. in the morning. She tied my legs with ropes because I wanted to actually run away. I was taken outside, stripped naked, and they poured cold water on me. So you can imagine someone waking you up at 3 a.m. in the morning. They take you outside, they've tied you up with ropes, and then they've stripped you naked. There's a large group of people waiting for you outside, and they come and whisper into your ears that we don't want you to shed any tears. You should not shed any tears. Okay? And the unfortunate thing is, after the cut, what follows is you're being forced to get married to an old man, and then they put some herbs in your vagina so that it can help with the healing process. So for me, it was a very, very, very shocking experience. And when I listened to this story, I was very, very bitter. I was personally very angry, and I really could not understand why someone could subject someone to this kind of humane treatment. The next slide. So the unfortunate thing is culture has taught so many of us, and especially the African culture, that if you go through any form of trauma, you need to numb it. Don't feel it. Don't feel the pain. You're not allowed to feel the pain. You need to suck it in, you know. It is just something that happened. You need to treat it as a by the way. And don't even talk about it. You continue, move on. This is how life is. This is how things happen. You've gone through FGM. Okay. Don't feel anything about it. Don't talk about it. Just move on, which is so sad. And many times, most of the survivors live with a lot of fear. They live in so much fear because a lot of them, the ones that I've actually interacted with, they kept telling me, this is the first time I am sharing my story. I've never talked about this with any specific person. This is the first time I'm sharing my story. Then there's a lot of shame attached to it because they don't want to open up about what exactly happened to them. And there's so much pain that comes with it. Again, taking you back to the clients that I've been working with, there was one who almost collapsed when we were doing our session, and that really shook me because I told her I would want to hear what your story is. What's going on in your life? Have you had any traumatic incidences? Then at that point, that's when she was able to open up and tell me that she went through FGM. So it's it's a very painful experience. And when we bring all these things together, culture and the issue of trauma and numbing feelings and not being able to express all these things, it makes a lot of FGM survivors suffer in silence, and they totally don't talk about it. The next slide. So mental health and FGM has a very, very strong correlation, which we cannot overlook. First, it's very good for us to note that mental health is a topic that is not openly discussed in Africa. And many times when someone states or explains that they are suffering from any form of mental illness, they associate with some, you've been bewitched, or you need some prayers and things like that. So it's not openly discussed in Africa. Of course, in terms, again, of treatment and interventions and having preventive programs, that still remains to be a major challenge. And just to emphasize and echo that FGM causes a lot of trauma to girls and women. And just to define and break down what trauma is, of course, it's an event that causes a lot of emotional and psychological effects to individuals. And in this context, the FGM survivors, and a major gap that still remains in many of the interventions that we are currently using in different parts of the world, be it Kenya, be it Africa, be it in other spaces. The aspect of incorporating psychosocial components in our intervention is lacking. I have seen a lot of good work happening in Kenya in terms of us trying to ensure that we are preventing the new cases of FGM, but I am yet to see aspects of psychosocial support being emphasized or being provided to FGM survivors. It's also difficult to detect mental health issues among children and young women. And this is because many times the notion that many of us have is, how can a child be depressed? How can they suffer from mental health issues, you know? So it becomes, one, difficult to detect, and also because of the different instruments that are being used, we don't have a lot of instruments and standardized instruments that can do proper assessment to ascertain certain kind of mental disorders among children and young people, but that is still developing. But of course, not to rule out that there are those that can give you telltale signs of mental health disorders among children and young people. This implies that girls and women who have been subjected to FGM live with a lot of mental distress. Imagine you went through the cut at the age of 8. You have never talked about it until you've probably been introduced to Venoranda at the age of 15, 16, or 17. It means that for around 10 or 15 or 20 years, you've been living with a lot of distress. You've been living with trauma. Probably you've been battling with anxiety. Maybe you're still struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder, which can be very dangerous. Okay? FGM survivors who've experienced, survivors who've experienced FGM suffer in silence and hardly get psychosocial support. So on a spectrum, you'd find that there are those who do not get an opportunity to actually talk about their experiences at all. And there are those, when they get the opportunity, they are talking about it for the first time. The next slide. So why is therapeutic support for survivors very, very important? And why am I emphasizing on the need for us to provide mental health support for FGM survivors? Number one, it empowers an individual to speak up. When you come for therapy, you've not talked about it, this is the first time you're talking about it, it empowers you to actually speak out. The second thing that it does, it helps you to vent out emotions. Many times when you've gone through any form of trauma or when you've experienced a traumatic incident, we've bottled within us a lot of fear, we have within us a lot of anger, we have within us a lot of bitterness, we have within us a lot of pain. Therapy gives you an opportunity for you to table down all those emotions and be able to name them and state, this is exactly how I feel based on what I went through. The other thing is it also supports FGM survivors to identify triggers and know how to manage them. And I'll give you an example. I had one of my clients who, when they would see a razor blade or a white piece of cloth, they would either faint or something would change. Something about them would change. They would just panic and be on a panic mode completely, okay? So one of the things that therapy teaches us, it helps us to identify my trigger. So when I see a razor blade, when I see a white cloth, what does this really mean to me? So therapy helps survivors to understand that this happened at that point, it's not happening now, and this is basically how I need to respond if I feel triggered or when I see those things that are going to remind me of this specific situation. The other thing that therapy seeks to do is, of course, it provides room for healing. Many times, if we bottle up the shame, the fear, the anger, the pain that we have within ourselves, it can be very, very toxic to individuals. So it gives you room for you to begin the healing process and also be in touch with yourself as a person. And of course, trauma is not something easy to heal. It's a step at a time. Other than that, it teaches you how to build resilience and become adaptable. And resilience in counseling is defined as the ability to bounce back and move forward. So you're bouncing back but not moving backward. You're bouncing back and purposing to move forward. So therapy tells you that you have gone through this. So how do you continue managing as you navigate through life? How do you adapt based on what happened to you? And it also gives you the ability to learn skills, especially coping skills, okay? And also managing anger. I had this specific client who was very, very aggressive, and she kept beating some young girls. Every now and then she would just be in fights and beating everybody who would want to come close to her and tell her anything. She would just be on up and arms and just fight them and beat them up. The next slide. So this is based on the different clients I've had an opportunity to interact with, and It's based on the different assessments I have been able to done as a result of my work with them. So the impacts of FGM on mental health, the first one is post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And this is a situation whereby a client would present symptoms of having flashbacks. Yeah, so during the day, they would have that scene of what happened on that specific day when they were going through the cut. They would have a lot of nightmares. It would be difficult for them to sleep at night. They would see certain objects and act in a different manner, and it would become very difficult for them to move. They would bottle within them a lot of negative emotions, and there are those who tend to be very, very aggressive. There are those who become extremely irritable, and there are those who can just spend a lot of time crying. The other thing that I also noted is a presentation of depression, and this ranges from moderate to severe. So there were those who were presenting with a bit of moderate to severe signs of depression. So a lot of lows. They were feeling low. They are isolated. They do not have friends. They do not have any form of self-worth. They have issues sleeping. They are generally disturbed. They are thinking too much. Other than that, there are those who present with so much anxiety, and others suffer from panic attacks. So there are points and time, especially when you would want them to talk about that specific instance of what happened, and they would start re-experiencing whatever they went through. You would pick that their heart is racing so fast, they are in too much panic, they are sweating, they are extremely worried. They would want to block that and not talk about it. And also they would have a lot of difficulties doing things or concentrating or doing things around them. The other thing that I found that was also very rampant is the issue of self-esteem, and a number of clients or a number of individuals I've interacted with during either individual or group sessions have been able to tell me that it's very difficult for me to really appreciate who I am. I have really been struggling to just appreciate who I am, because I don't know, I don't understand why this happened. That's the first thing. The people who are supposed to be protecting me are the same people who subjected me to this. So I really don't have any value that I attach to myself. And I am not saying that these are impacts that present to everybody. Of course, individuals are extremely different, but I just want to echo that these are some of the things that have come out very, very, very strongly as I interact and relate with my clients. In terms of interventions, because I greatly work with children and young people, take me to the next slide. One of the things that has proved to be very, very powerful is the use of art. Art therapy is so powerful. And there's a very interesting quote there: when words are not enough, okay? And there are points and time when you don't even know what words to put to your trauma or what words to put to your pain. The approach that I use when addressing the approach that I use when addressing such kind of clients who are not able to put words to their pain is draw for me what you feel. Write out exactly what you're feeling. So I've been able to employ the use of art with children and with some teenagers when I'm working with them. And another powerful tool that I've used is getting to know what is their story. I want to hear what your story is. And it's not just about hearing what their story is. I go a step further and tell them, do you want to actually rewrite your story? Because many times their story is, this is what I've gone through. This is what I've gone through. I don't like my life, I do not value who I really am, I don't value myself, so I would want to get a different feel of, yes, this is your story, but would you want to rewrite your script? Okay? What value do you attach to yourself, or what are you telling yourself based on probably what you've been able to go through? And then the use of breathing exercise has proved to be very, very powerful, and not basically as a standalone intervention, but as an intervention that is mixed with other different treatment approaches. And this basically helps FGM survivors to calm down and for them to be able to relax, especially when they're narrating and sharing their painful and traumatic experiences. Okay? So just telling them to breathe in 5 times and breathe out 5 times, it helps them remain calm and releases a lot of anxiety and negative energy that they've been holding within. So this is something that I've found very, very helpful as I work with clients. Every other time that we are starting a session, when things get intense in therapy and when we are winding up, we have to inhale good things and exhale all the bad things. Then other than that, the use of something called a cognitive triangle. So just trying to understand, what am I thinking? What is Venoranda thinking about herself? And how are my thoughts affecting my feelings and my behaviors? And the simple analogy of this cognitive triangle is it basically states that if you have a negative thought, the feeling is definitely going to be negative and your behaviors are going to be negative, okay? And it doesn't mean that we dispute or we refuse that you've gone through any form of trauma or you have negative feelings. We admit that, yes, these are the feelings that I have, yeah? But are these feelings healthy? No, they are not. So what do I need to do? How then do I move from having these negative feelings and develop positive feelings moving forward, okay? And it also helps in trying to understand what event happened to you, what beliefs did you pick as a result of the event that happened to you, and what are the consequences of the beliefs that you currently have as an individual. And also just to include a different intervention that I've also seen very helpful when I was having a conversation with the married women. Many of them are slowly embracing aspects of exploring reconstructive surgery. Okay, though it's something that it's not openly discussed as such. But a number of them could say that these are things that we need to embrace. These are things that we actually need to talk about. And in terms of FGM and COVID, next slide. I think it's good for us to know that COVID has come in with a lot of challenges, and it has influenced the escalation of FGM cases, especially in Kenya. It's so unfortunate to note that as at last week, there's one of the activists in Kenya who was busy mobilizing and tweeting and they were saying that we need something to be done in one of our regions because over 500 girls have actually gone through a cut in the past, I think, 1 or 2 weeks, okay? And this means that the efforts that we have been making or the progress that we have been making are slowly slipping away. So it's very important for us to know that home is not a safe haven for everybody, including girls or women. At times, school is a safe haven for some people, okay? And at the moment, many schools are closed. At this point in time, it becomes very difficult for us to access services, and also getting support is very, very difficult because, one, there are mobility issues. You're not allowed to move from one space to another. If I'm in Nairobi, I cannot go into a different space because I'm not allowed to. So what does that mean if I am supposed to go through FGM, yet I need to run and go into a different county, for example. It means that I will just have to, I'll be confined and I will not have options. Yeah. Then in terms of programs and interventions, 3/4 of things are on hold. Yeah. And many FGM programs are done on the ground. This means that not much is really happening on the ground, though there are so many social media campaigns, and I've been seeing Men End FGM in Kenya have been having a lot of live chats just to make sure that they touch base with the different activists who are doing a lot of work at grassroots levels. But we must acknowledge that this message is still not getting to everybody because interventions are currently on a hold. And finally, it's very important for us. These are my recommendations. There is great need for us to continue working with grassroots organizations and champions, particularly men, because they play an integral role in addressing whatever is currently happening. So it's really, really key for us to continue working with grassroots organizations, with champions, and include men in our interventions. Then we need to create a holistic approach when addressing FGM programming. Let's talk about prevention and management for survivor, especially the mental health aspect. And this I will emphasize because we are talking about prevention, which is a very good thing, but we need to merge the two, okay? We are talking about prevention, but as at I think last week, 2 weeks, there are 500 girls in Kenya who have been subjected to FGM. Who is going to, for example, address their psychosocial support? Who's going to provide them with psychosocial support? I have no idea. We don't know how that's going to happen. And we even have structures in place to support FGM survivor when it comes to mental health. I do not think so. Yeah. So we really need to make sure that we strengthen programming from prevention to management. As we prevent it, for those who've gone through the cut, how do we support them to access psychosocial support? And I have seen I think close to nil. I'm not sure if I've been able to come across any organization that is purely addressing trauma among FGM survivors. Providing just trauma services for FGM survivors. It's very, very difficult to get such. And this is why I'm calling upon any donor who's represented in the meeting or anyone who sits on any decision-making table. And of course, we need to continue pushing with our government that there's so much need for us to continue investing in psychosocial support for FGM survivor. Mental health is a very, very important aspect. If Venoranda is not mentally well, if I'm not mentally healthy, it means that my other aspects of life are going to be affected. I will not perform in my studies. I will not be a good person when I am relating with other people. Okay? I will not be able to achieve my goals. I will not be able to achieve my dreams and name all those things. So this is something that we need to continually invest. That as we do prevention, we also need to encourage people to invest in offering psychosocial support for survivors. Because my greatest concern is if I have been living with trauma for 10, 15, 20 years, never talked about it, I haven't had the space to talk about the kind of trauma I went through. What is really going on inside of me? We can't know. It's very difficult, okay? And where there's depression, aspects of suicide are very, very high, yeah? So these are things that we need to tame at a very early age. And that's why I try as much as possible to interact and engage with children and young people, especially those who've been subjected to the practice at a tender age, so that I'm able to arrest the situation before they grow up. And I think finally it's important for us to intensify our advocacy campaign as at the moment, because FGM has increased due to COVID, and we need to continue holding our leaders accountable. I know Kenya is one of the countries that recently stated during the ICPD summit in Nairobi that we are looking forward to ending FGM by 2022. Okay? So we need to remind our leaders, this is what you have said, but this is what is happening on the ground. What is going on? What is going on? What is not adding up? Okay? And also what we also need to do from our end so that we are able to strengthen the different things that are happening in the ground. And just to echo what had been highlighted earlier, it's also very hard to get services around mental health. The different spaces I've been, I will not lie, there are spaces where the people who have been coming for therapy either pay for the sessions, or I'm invited as a speaker and I'm paid to facilitate the healing process of FGM survivors through group therapy. Or I've probably said I would want to give back to girls who are from this community and they're in this specific center, so let me go and visit them, and as part of my giving back, spend time and let us talk about trauma. But it's very hard for anyone to get mental health services and psychosocial support for FGM survivors in Kenya, and I think these are some of the things that we need to explore. So how then do we ensure that these aspects are strengthened, particularly even for health practitioners who maybe at some point might interact with FGM survivors, and also with the community activists? How then do we ensure that we have these kinds of support so that survivors are able to be well and to be mentally well, to be mentally healthy? That's it from my end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Venoranda, for your interventions. I think we have about 5 questions for you that will come at the end. I suggest that we go real quick with Farzana, doctor, so that we finish with the presentations and then we'll come to questions. You're also welcome to send your questions into the chat box that is on our webinar application. So we'll straight ahead invite Farzana to talk. Farzana, doctor, is a registered social worker in the private practice that is in Toronto, Canada. And she is a founding member of We Speak Out and the End FGM Canada Network. She is the author so far of 4 novels, and there is another one coming in September 2020 that addressed FGM in the Daudi Bohra community and was inspired by her experiences as a survivor and an activist. So a fun fact about Farzana is that she writes in the morning, and no, she doesn't write about psychology or psychotherapy. She also writes fiction novels. I do not know why I wanted to put her in a box and just assume that she writes about what her profession is, but her profession is writer, and she does also a bit of psychotherapy, and she consults in the afternoon. That is her schedule. Thank you very much. You are welcome, Farzana. We are listening to you.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. And can you put the presentation up on the screen?
Sure.
Okay, full screen. Thank you so much. So thank you to the organizers for inviting me, and to all of you who are here today. We have about 40 people, I think, and that's really wonderful. So can you start just with the slide 1 right now? Go back a couple of slides. So I come to this conversation as a survivor, as an activist, and a psychotherapist who works with trauma, but not with FGM survivors. So I'm going to be explaining a little bit about my own healing journey, and I'll just go from there. So this slide is from a suburb of Mumbai. It's my sister and myself and an auntie of ours. And it's taken in front of a mosque that my great-great-grandfather built for his mother. Our community is Daudi Bohra. We're from India, and I grew up in Canada, and I live in Toronto. In our community, it's estimated that in my generation, 85% of girls experienced type 1 or type 4 FGM. We call it kutna or cuffs. In most cases, it's either the removal of the clitoral hood or a cut to the clitoral hood around the age of 7, plus or minus a few years. Current estimates are somewhere between 70 and 80% of people experiencing this, but we need more research to know for sure. It's a very secretive and taboo practice, and such survivors are told not to talk about it. And until about 2015, when survivors began to publicly speak and write about it, there was almost no public discussion, and many people didn't even realize that FGM happens in India. It's mostly done by amateur cutters, but there has been some medicalization of the practice with doctors carrying it out. And some of you may have heard that there was a recent case in Detroit, Michigan, in the US, where a doctor was charged. And later on, I'll talk a little bit about my own specific experiences around mental health. So the next slide, please. So I became involved in We Speak Out. Please follow us. You can see our handles. I became involved in We Speak Out in 2015, and we work in the Bora context. There's also another group called SAIO that works in the Bora context, and I'm also loosely involved with them too. There's also, you need to know, there's also a well-funded pro-Kutna group that argues that Kutna is not really FGM, and they argue for their rights to continue the practice as a religious right. And obviously we don't agree that people's religious rights trump human rights. In India, there is no specific FGM law, but there is a case before the Supreme Court that has been stalled because of COVID. Next slide. I'm a founding member of the End FGM Canada Network. Please follow us as well, and there's the information about who we are. Our focus is to create a national action plan to urge the government to do that. We have very few services for survival, almost very few. And although it's been illegal in Canada, FGM has been illegal since 97, there have been no prosecutions, and this is quite serious because we believe that there might be, this is anecdotal, but we believe that there might be cutting happening here, and there's also vacation cutting that happens. And we estimate that there's about 100,000 survivors. So this is something we need to have some changes around, and that's what this organization is working on, and it's been around for about a year and a half. We're new. So as I mentioned, I don't work with survivors of FGM. I'm a registered social worker in private practice, and I have a particular interest in attachment, hypnosis, somatic work, energy psychology, and parts work. And I've used much of that knowledge to assist myself in understanding my own healing journey and doing peer-to-peer conversations around mental health with survivors. So the next slide, just very quickly, as Cynthia mentioned, I'm also an author, and I'm really hoping that this fourth novel, 7, will be a contribution to the movement as it describes what happens with Kutna survivors. So my next slide now. So one of the things I would really like to bring to this conversation is the need for our movement to become more trauma-informed. I'm sure all of you would agree with this desire too. So often survivors and activists don't have enough access to basic information about trauma. And sometimes our activists will unintentionally propagate myths about how all of this works. For example, I've heard statements like, "You never forget that terrible moment in your life," or "If you don't remember it, it probably wasn't that bad or didn't really impact you." We need to ensure that survivors and activists understand that sometimes FGM is experienced through intrusive remembering and flashbacks. But sometimes it's through dissociation that the coping is happening. or some combination of both. I really know that trauma gets housed in the body, and sometimes it's experienced in very indirect ways of coping, and Venoranda mentioned this through anxiety, for example. And these indirect ways of remembering are deeply difficult and destabilizing. So being trauma-informed would help survivor activists, as well as non-survivor activists who can experience vicarious trauma, as Venoranda mentioned. And if we have more of this knowledge, I think we're going to be much better at accessing our boundaries and limits in the work so that we can enact much better self-care. Sometimes I think we don't have a lot of longevity in this movement. People will need to take long breaks. I've had to take breaks. I think sometimes people leave the movement. And I think that's because we get burnt out. And I think if we had more knowledge about vicarious trauma and trauma, we'd be around Trauma 101 and things like the neurobiology of trauma. I think that would help us all a lot. So I'll just tell you a little bit about my own journey now. My memories are somewhat patchy because of dissociation. It's one of my favorite, I say that with a laugh, my favorite coping strategies. But this is what I understand to have happened from my healing journey. My parents are quite liberal, and my father actually renounced the religion. From conversations I've had with him in recent years, I know that both of my parents would have been against the practice and would have refused familial pressures to do Khatna. While we were visiting India when I was a young child, a family member who thought they knew better, because really when this happens, when family members take their kids for this, it's because they think they know better. They took me without my parents knowing. I have some memories of the actual traumatic event, which I won't describe, as it is still quite triggering for me, and maybe it would be triggering for some of you too. I know that when I hear detailed descriptions of FGM trauma, I really have to ground myself. So what I can tell you is that Khatna happens in the context, and this is the same for most forms of FGM, it happens in the context of a child being duped, shocked, exposed to pain, and then denial that anything actually really happened. That whole sucking up thing that Venoranda talked about. And then no one talks about it after the fact. So I have also a strong sense that I was very much told and threatened to keep it a secret. And my young mind understood that that threat would come true if I did tell. And so I didn't. Plus, I was told that nothing actually happened to me, which is just really confusing. So the combination of a secret, of silence, and denial is a very common experience for all forms of sexual trauma. And survivors will often talk about this very confusing mix of what happens. So I only began to make sense of all of this after becoming an activist in 2015. We're talking 5 years ago. I'm nearly 50. So when the memories began to surface, they came up in ways I could identify. But I think prior to that, there were lots of indications of the trauma in my mind and body before that, but I didn't recognize them as such. I began to have nightmares, low mood, lots of crying. I began to have sexual freeze responses with my partner. What helped me a great deal as I began to untangle all of this was the access to a lot of knowledge that I have about the practice, things I picked up through knowing other activist survivors. And my particular constellation of activist and psychotherapist put me in a very empowered and privileged position compared to so many survivors. Because as all of these things were happening to me, I could say, oh, Farzana, this is trauma. So I sought out a therapist, and she was a white Canadian therapist. I sent her links to the We Speak Out website so that she would have some context. I really knew that I didn't want to go to her and teach her. It was so dysregulating at that time to talk about any of this. And so I couldn't do all that teaching to my therapist. And I only partly believed myself at the time, which is a very common experience for all kinds of sexual trauma, this doubt and minimizing of an experience. So it really helped me that this therapist believed me. We began working with the sexual freeze responses, and I learned how to pause during them with self-compassion without panic, to self-calm. I learned mindfulness. And I learned that I could own my body and I could own my sexuality. And I would have never known prior to that I didn't know how to do that. I would have described myself as very sex positive before that, and sexually liberated. I would have thought of myself with those terms. But until I started doing that work with that therapist, I didn't even realize that I didn't own my own body. Or a part of me thought I didn't. My partner was an excellent teammate in the journey. He also learned how to pause non-judgmentally and reminded me to ground in those moments. Very helpful to have a partner in this journey. Another helpful intervention came when I asked a gynecologist to let me know what she saw during an examination. Now, some Katna survivors don't have any visible scarring, while others do. She told me I had a little scar, but added, "I don't know where you'd get that from." I can't recall if I educated her in that moment because her words were both incredibly overwhelming and affirming in that moment. So doctors in Canada may have some training around type 3 FGM, thanks to all the fabulous work that survivors of that type have been doing since the 90s. There was a big upsurge in the 90s of this kind of work that was being done, and in the last 20 years, so much of it has gone silent in Canada. But so doctors might know something about type 3, but type 1 is not on their radar. Type 4 is not on their radar. And so my doctor didn't know how to make sense or to help me to understand what this little scar meant. A couple of years after that, can I have the next slide? A couple of years after that, I attended an activist retreat with other Bora women organized by Sayo. And there was a lot of sharing of experiences, and particularly in the Bora context, which further cracked open more memory for me. And while this was really painful, it began a new round of healing work for me. Hearing the stories of other people can be so powerful in the healing journey. It was almost like a group therapy experience that we had, even though it was an activist retreat. And let's go to the next slide. So I sought out a therapist who does somatic experiencing work, a form of therapy developed by Peter Levine. Now, Peter Levine spent some time observing prey animals who recover from life-threatening situations by physically releasing the energy that accumulates in their body. You've probably seen dogs do a big shakeout after they've been scared. We humans, unfortunately, tend to do the opposite, overriding our natural ways of regulating our nervous systems. So instead, we have freeze responses that are accompanied by shame, fear, and self-judgment. So somatic experiencing helps us to move past the place where there might be stuckness in processing a traumatic event. And I think this is one of the most powerful techniques for working with trauma. So just look up Peter Levine. There's lots of free YouTube videos out there where he explains his work. Finally, I also did some sessions around internal family systems therapy, which is a form of therapy I do myself. And this form of therapy works with protector parts. For example, we might have a protector part that numbs or distracts or doubts our trauma, that likes to get drunk to cope. And so we are able to access those protector parts and then access the wound that is underneath. And we can access the wound directly and then unburden and actually heal from some of those wounds. So the next slide, please. I also had to do some spiritual healing work, which meant that I needed to question things like, what does it even mean to be Bora? What does it mean to be Muslim? Did I want to be any of those things? I had to reclaim my Muslim identity. And I actually had to think a lot about coming from a long line of ancestors who have been part of both experiencing and perpetuating this intergenerational trauma. I had to think a lot about that because I believe that our ancestors are so important to us as our spiritual helpers. But what did it mean that they were also people who harmed us? So I'm still working on that. I'm still working on forgiving them. Today, I am less activated as I talk to you, but I need to tell you that when I first started doing this activist work, I would be pretty much emotionally wrecked for a day or so afterwards. And I wondered what the point was of doing the activism when it seemed like I was doing self-harm to myself. I had to take that to therapy as well. But it's much better today, and it's because I've had to do some work with my young self to let her know that I won't get in trouble for speaking out, that we might actually help others, and that we have to be warriors if we're going to stop FGM in our lifetimes. And my inner child listens to me now, which is really great. There are still aspects of my story that I won't talk about with people publicly because it's too revealing for my inner child, and I expect this will shift over time as everything else has. So I'll just stop there so that we can open up the conversation to all the participants here, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Farzana. I think as everybody on the chat today, on the webinar, I believe we know how strong and how much having a conversation like that takes from you. And we respect that. Maybe not everyone will have the chance to tell you, but I just wanted to step in and say thank you to both of you, Farzana and to Venoranda. You go through a lot, and thank you for even having the courage to share. So we will go straight into questions real quick. Our session on the Q&A. We have a number of questions on the chat. The team will help me put them together. I think if at all there is any question on Facebook, you will help bring them here, Steph, right? All right. So the first question that I have is mainly to Veneranda to ask, how easy or how hard or how impossible actually is it for survivors of FGM in this side of the globe, in our countries, in our region, to access the mental health services? That's one. The second is, do they even know, are they aware that they actually need that kind of service? If you can hear me, Venoranda? Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you. So just to respond to your questions, one, it's very difficult to access mental health support for FGM survivors in Kenya.
Okay.
Then the second question, most of the times, it's very young girls and young women who've been subjected to the practice. And a lot of times they're just numb about the whole situation, and it's not this is because of where they're coming from. This has been a practice, it has been happening. Then how do I even take note that this is actually a concern from my end? So it's purely from a point of what culture has been able to teach many of us, that trauma, you've gone through pain, you've gone through this, you've experienced this, you just sit there and deal with it. You don't need to go and get professional help so that you're able to address whatever is going on. And many times, many people do not really recognize that they actually are going through mental distress or they're having mental health concerns.
Yeah, okay. And I wanted to ask Farzana real quick before we go to the questions that are on the chat for both of you. Is a childhood trauma like yours, is it likely to determine what kind of adult woman that you'll be, even if, say, you change your environment? It happened in India, maybe you were young, and then you go to Canada, say you are almost 50 years old today. Would you have, say, if you had not had access to the therapy and had the privilege, of access to that kind of those kind of services, do you think you will really be a very different person today? What kind of person would you be?
It's very hard to know, right? And everybody has a different experience of healing and trauma. I think if I hadn't done this work in the last 5 years, I would be still dealing with some of the mood issues, with some of the sexual issues. I think that although I wanted to push ahead and be an activist in this area, I probably would have dropped out of the movement by now because it would have been too triggering. But, you know, I also think that so many of the people I know who become therapists are people who have experienced trauma. I would say like 90% of the people I know. And I think that that's part of what directs us to go into this field of work, is that some part of us knows that as we are working with doing healing work with other people, we're also absorbing that. We get kind of a secondary healing process, and we have access to all of this knowledge. So it's hard to know. So many survivors I know will say, you know, it was in the past. I'm not going to, you know, dwell there. So they just move on. They just move on. They just move on. And I think that just they find a lot of ways to move on. Sometimes ways.
Thank you. So now on the chat, I think we have a question from Marco, and it says, our main difficulties in terms of mental impact is because of the ancient women who say, I have gone through this and I have children now, or I've had children, so you will also be fine. So that kind of narrative, say, it's hard to change, and we are not hearing different perspectives. So we're asking, what is your advice on that, Venoranda?
Okay. I think that's a very concerning question, and I would also get concerned. But I just want to give my own point of view that the many women who are actually married and they've gone through FGM, one of the things that I keep hearing them saying over and over again is, I will never allow my child to go through this. I can never allow my girl child to go through the same experience that I actually went through. So for them, they come from a point of where they've actually accepted that this it actually destroyed a part of me, and it was very traumatic to me. Then I cannot allow it anymore. And maybe what I pick from the statement that has been stated is, it looks like this statement is very, very defensive, especially when someone says, I would like it's more of they're trying to build walls, and maybe Farzana can talk more about it. Like, you know, it has happened. I have children. I moved on. I am leaving. So what? It's actually a defense mode. It's someone who's operating on a defense mode. And my advice about that would be that, for me, I think it's very important for us to continue encouraging these conversations, because it's not about trying to make people think or feel that this is actually a wrong, but it's just trying to help people understand that this has a lot of impacts, both physically, both psychologically, to specific individuals. And this is a good point where I would want to pull down, to support this group of women to pull down those defenses and try and ask them, you know, of course, you know, you've moved on. This happened, yes. You have children right now. It's not a matter of overreacting, but what can you actually do differently for the generations to come? That would be a very good point for them to reflect through, because they've gone through it, yes, but then how has that impacted their lives, and how are they willing to move on in order for them to support the upcoming generation?
Thank you very much. My colleague Steph will ask the following question.
So I think both of you have addressed in different ways the importance of training professionals. I heard Farzana talk about your experience with a healthcare professional that wasn't so positive and had negative inputs on your well-being. And there is a question also about this from Fabienne, who is the director of GAMS Belgium. She's saying that in Kenya there's a psychological organization, and she's wondering if FGM is something, and how to provide support is something that's in the curricula for psychologists in Kenya. And I wanted actually to broaden this question and ask it to both of you. What do you think about the way that mental health professionals and also other professionals, how they are trained on FGM? Are they trained on FGM in your communities in Canada and in Kenya and the other communities that you may know? And is FGM integrated in the curricula, or is it only people who have a specific interest who go and find the information? Because often that's the way it is, for example, in Belgium. Often.
Yeah, it's what you just said about how it works. I think if people seek it out, they can find the information. It's not addressed as a central part of the curriculum, and it's not integrated in looking at gender-based violence either. And I think it really needs to be. And it really, I think that even with doctors, they don't understand the subtleties. They understand maybe the broad picture, but you need to have the subtleties. With trauma, the devil is in the details, and we need to be able to help people to deepen conversations in order to help them, right? So I think there's such a lack of knowledge.
Thank you. Venoranda, you want to add something about?
Sure, I agree with what Farzana has said. I did my BA in counseling, I did my MA still in psychology, but no touch on FGM, no touch on sexual and gender-based violence. So for me, that's something that we really need to think about. What does that mean if we are training practitioners, yet they are not conversant with some of the emerging issues that are currently happening around the world?
So I also had another question. It's both of you also speak about, I think I wrote it also by written, both of you speak about the silence that covers this practice, the fact that girls can go, like you said, Venoranda, for 10, 15 years without ever speaking about what they experienced. Living with the trauma alone, and Farzana also spoke about the importance of community, and I'm wondering how in that setting that community-based approaches or grassroots organizations or working really with group activities, how you feel that that's an opportunity to address also mental health and well-being for women, rather than only the kind of more individual therapeutic journey that is also not always accessible to all women and girls.
I mentioned going to the SAIO activist retreat and how it felt very much like group therapy. And I think those kinds of things are really helpful. Both SAIO and We Speak Out have been involved in doing storytelling workshops as well. And we're hoping that this happens with the Canada context as well. We've applied for some funding for that. So I think storytelling is huge, when you hear someone share a story. And I think part of why I've been interested in sharing the story about my journey of healing is that I haven't heard very much of that. And I think that it might help people who maybe have been in denial about their own need of healing to listen to a story of healing.
Thank you. Very powerful. Venoranda, do you want to add something about this?
Yeah, sure. I keep emphasizing and I keep saying that the best way for us to break that kind of suffering or that kind of fear is by speaking out, and speaking out is very important, even for our mental well-being. And I found it very productive for many women who've gone through FGM actually come together, like the different group therapies that I've done with FGM survivors. When one starts sharing, the other person would say, I can relate to what this other person has shared. So for me, guys having a safe space where they can actually share their stories and just speak out is one of the things that is going to make sure that we break that chain of suffering and end that silence.
Thank you. Cynthia, do you want to take the next question?
Yes, sure.
Don't hesitate to ask other questions if you have more from the public.
Yeah, so there is a Salome who said, what do you think about general therapy? Do you think general therapy can help women that have undergone FGM? Farzana, I think you said the devil is in the detail, but what if it's not necessarily FGM specialists taking care of you, but a general practitioner that has no necessarily knowledge of FGM? Can it help?
I think that it has to be a trauma-informed perspective. So I worked with I worked with 3 different therapists over the years who didn't have any FGM specific knowledge, but they were all very experienced in trauma, and they could make the links very directly, and that's what I needed, and that was how I ended up doing, the various types of therapy that I mentioned. So I think that's most important.
Okay. All right. There's also a question that came in from Isma. It's a question of really the focus that we put on religion. She said, how do you overcome the religious aspect and the taboo around psychology and mental health? What is your strategy to make sure that seeing and talking to a mental health professional won't be harder on them, knowing the social, the community, and the pressure that are in there? Is there any strategy, or do you have any thought about that, Venoranda?
I think one of the things that we are really trying to do, especially here in Kenya, is busting a lot of myths and seeing how best we can be able to deal with stigma around mental health, because it's a major issue. And one of the strategies that I've seen work very, very well is the use of evidence and scientific studies as I state whatever it is that I'm stating, because if something is based on studies or it's evidence-based, then it gives it more credibility. And the other thing is we are trying to make it very, very normal, and we are trying to make it look okay, that it's very fine to ask for help, and there's nothing wrong if you're asking for help. But also trying to demystify some of the things that associate mental health. For example, saying if you're going through a mental illness, you're either bewitched or you're evil and things like that. So these are some of the things that we're also trying to bust and give people correct information about what exactly is mental health, what is it caused by, and what predisposes people to get affected by mental health issues and things like that, just based on studies and scientific knowledge.
How about you, Farzana? Because you also mentioned going through questioning and wondering your role and your stand in the religious upbringing that you had.
Mm-hmm. So again, I think I used trauma therapy as the method for that. So I mentioned internal family systems work, and so I needed to look at, the parts of me that had been really harmed by the religion and the negative messages that I had taken in around the religion. Because again, as I mentioned, the devil's in the details. So, you're a small child and you're trying to make sense of what's going on for you, right? And you have because you have such little knowledge and little context, you're making sense of things through a very childlike lens, right? So if in that moment you say, religion is bad, religion is bad, religion is bad because this bad thing is happening to me, you're going to take that forward into your adult life. And then as an adult, you need to untangle that and realize, that was just a way of understanding it at the time that was maybe limited. And what do we really want from religion as an adult? What makes sense for us today?
Yeah, I see. There is a question from Zahara. She said, how do you deal with the anger against FGM? I think each of us would respond differently based on how much information we have or how much exposure we've had. But let's hear it from you firsthand, and then we'll go to Venoranda, who sees many people who have gone through that.
Yeah,
how do you deal with that?
I think there's no one answer to this, but I think we have to validate our feelings, whatever they are. So we have to say, yes, yes, we're angry, and yes, we're allowed to be angry, and yes, there's good reason, to be angry. So first we have to acknowledge, validate it. Maybe there's some release that we need to have, some physical release, Sometimes we need to have a kind of a redo of the experience where we imagine that we got to fight back. We couldn't as children. You can write it out, you can paint it out, all the stuff that Venoranda was talking about around art therapy. But we have to do something with it. We have to have it move through our body.
Yeah. Venoranda?
Yeah, and I agree. I totally agree with Farzana. Because every other time, and not just when working with FGM survivors, even those who've gone through different forms of trauma, maybe let's say even rape, and it comes in with a lot of emotions. And it's very important for us to acknowledge that we are human, and such situations or such experiences can get us off, and it's fine and it's okay for us to get angry. But then I also need to reflect back and ask myself, then what am I doing with that anger? Because if I don't purpose to deal with it in the right way, it might be very harmful to me, or I might harm myself with it. So the good thing to ask ourselves is, yes, I'm hungry, I'm angry, but what do I do with that anger?
Yeah, so I wanted to ask a question, which is it's come from two different places. There have been questions about how non-survivors of FGM can support women and girls with FGM and the movement in general. And there was another question also about how men can support the therapy journey of women with FGM and girls. So I wanted to ask these two, what can women who are not themselves survivors of FGM and men, how can they support, in your opinion, women living with FGM who are struggling from mental health issues or well-being issues?
With that one, maybe I think that they already are doing it. I could see from the participants here that there are many people's names I recognize, and they are allies. And so I think it's about knowing how to be an ally, right? An ally listens, an ally supports. I think I would, as I mentioned before, I really like the allies to have the trauma-informed knowledge, so that they can be really mindful of how they are getting triggered too. In both of the organizations that I've worked with, I've wondered about the amount of work that people take on, and I've wondered when people are going to burn out. And I think we need to be including much more self-care as part of our conversations in this movement. But I think the allies are doing so much work already. In terms of men, I think, I would, my partner is very shy, but I kind of wish that he would do a little workshop for male partners and female partners as well of FGM survivors. I think partners need to learn how they can be really helpful when someone is being triggered and experiencing trauma in their bodies. Can I just also say one thing? This doesn't fit with your question exactly, but
go ahead. No worries.
We talk about girls and women survivors, and we also need to remember that there are lots of survivors who don't identify as women any longer. There might be trans-identified men. They might be non-binary. And this is something I would really like our movement to think about, that, not all survivors are heterosexual, and there are some survivors who don't identify as girls and women as well.
Thank you, Farzana. That is actually a very, very good point that you're making. And it's something that's very under-researched as well. We are really struggling in Belgium, where we have done a small study in Brussels on the sexual and reproductive health needs of women living with FGM in Brussels. And we've identified some needs for non-heterosexual women in terms of information and just like having other people like them to speak to, because sometimes when you're afraid of homophobia, you might not be able to share your experience of FGM with heterosexual women from your community.
Yeah.
So it's something that I think it's really, really important. Thank you for joining. And I've personally never seen any information on non-binary people or trans men living with FGM. I think it's really a big gap in the research and in the information generally. You, Venoranda, do you want to add something about how to be a good ally?
Yes. Of course, you cannot give what you have, what you don't have. And I think one of the things that I'm becoming more deliberate about is the fact that I need to look out for me first before I look out for other people. Otherwise, this work is very, very overwhelming. It comes in with a lot, like I mentioned, a lot of vicarious trauma. So I need to make sure that I'm really taking very good care of myself. And of course, this is a conversation that we need to hammer more and more and more and more. Self-care is not being selfish. Self-care is acknowledging that you need to also preserve yourself as you continue taking care of others and also championing for rights. So for me, it's something that is extremely integral, and it's a conversation that we really need to have, because I've gotten to a point of where I'm almost getting a burnout. I'm like, okay, so what am I doing wrong? I'm like, Venoranda, you're seeing too many clients. You need to slow down, yeah. So I think it's something that we really need to be aware about. That we totally need to prioritize ourselves as allies, so that we are able to take care of others out there.
Thank you. That's indeed very important. I wanted to see if there are other questions.
I think maybe Venoranda should just mention a little bit the role of men, because she talked about it in her presentation.
Yeah, you spoke about the male activists in Kenya. What do you think about how they can support female and people living with FGM and who have mental health issues, or even generally, of course, but because we're speaking about mental health?
Yeah, we have a very strong movement called Men and FGM in Kenya, and they're doing a lot of good work here. And I think one of the things that I've been seeing them call out different decision makers this week is, you're saying you've identified 500 girls who underwent through the CAT last week. In terms of psychosocial support, what plans are you having for them? So I've seen them put our leaders in check, holding them accountable, and asking them, raising those questions of what are you providing psychosocial support for them. For me, they play a very integral role, because these are the people who work very closely when the girl is supposed to go through a CAT. So if we continue empowering them and telling them that you need to stand in the gap and ensure that this does not happen, and continue to ensure that as we advocate for prevention, then we also need to emphasize aspect of provisions of psychosocial support, then I think the message is going to go a very, very long way. So we need to keep hammering that as we do preventive, then we also need to think about management and bring out aspects of how are we supporting FGM survivors with provision of psychosocial support.
Thank you very much. I think time is soon run out. If there are no other questions, I will invite everyone also. Everyone, not everyone. I will invite those of you who may have be lucky enough to speak French as well to the second webinar that we're doing next week. So this is the visual of the next webinar. It's next Wednesday. It's going to be in French, but we will also try to do a summary of this webinar that we will, of course, translate in French, as we always do, and the same thing for the next one, because I think that the discussions we've had today was really so powerful and really, really great. So I think it would be a pity not to, for the persons who don't speak English to not be able to access it. And so, of course, we will do the same the other way around. Cynthia, do you want to give a few closing remarks?
Yeah.
On my side, I just really want to thank Venoranda and Farzana Both your interventions were really great. I hadn't had the chance to meet with both of you yet, so I'm very happy to meet you. And I hope that we will all continue the discussion on the community of practice group. For those who are not members, of course, you're free to join. And over to you, Cynthia.
Yes, thank you very much, Steph, for introducing this webinar and for everyone who has attended. I think it was very, it's a conversation. When I was speaking with speakers before, we agreed we were going to have a genuine conversation, and I think that's what exactly happened. We thank you very much, Farzana and Venoranda, for what you have done, for your selfless work, and we hope that more people will join this movement. As you may see on the chart, very many people are thankful for your interventions. We didn't want to go through each one of them, but I'm sure you can go through them and read by yourselves and see how overwhelmingly thankful we are. Lastly, we will share this recording so that you may also share the link to the rest of the people, for them for everyone who has attended, for everyone who has registered, to see what we were talking about. Thank you very much, and let's keep in touch. Let's keep the conversation going also on our group, on the community of practice.
And if you come up with other questions afterwards, I see there's one that we won't have time to handle from Facebook. We will bring them back into the Google group, and we can continue the discussion with new questions to both Farzana and Venoranda, and of course all other people who have experience in this issue. Thank you very, very much, and have a good evening or afternoon wherever you're in the world.
Yeah. Or morning in Canada.
Or morning, maybe in Canada, yes. I hope it's not too early for you, Farzana.
It's very late in Nairobi, at least. And everywhere you may be. All right.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.